You've seen it your whole life. In the Beatitudes, in Proverbs, on coffee mugs and church bulletins and the kind of Instagram posts that end with a little dove emoji. And you've always known what it means. Low self-opinion, thinking little of yourself, getting out of the way so other people can shine. Maybe being the person who deflects compliments and says it was nothing when it was clearly something. But you're reading a translation of a translation, and the Hebrew word underneath that English word doesn't describe a personality type. It describes a posture, a physical one. The posture of an animal with a wooden beam fastened across its neck. That changes everything. The English word humble comes from the Latin humilis, low, from the earth, close to the ground, humus, soil. And for centuries, English-speaking Christians have read that Latin ghost into their Hebrew Bible without realizing it. When you picture a humble person, you probably picture someone quiet, soft-spoken, deferential, maybe even a little passive, someone who doesn't take up too much space in a room. The Hebrew language has no patience for that image. The primary Hebrew word family behind our word humble is built on the root ana, spelled ayin nun he in Hebrew, Strong's H6031. The Brown Driver Briggs lexicon, one of the standard academic references for biblical Hebrew, defines this root as to be bowed down, afflicted. Not bowed down in the sense of a polite curtsy. Bowed down the way an animal is bowed when a yoke is fastened across its shoulders. Bowed because real weight has been placed. Bowed because a direction has been given. Bowed not in defeat, but in submission to a specific authority that is larger and stronger than the animal being yoked. Imagine you are standing in a field in ancient Israel. Early morning, the light still thin, mist still sitting on the hillside. 2 oxen are being led out to plow. And here's what the farmer does not do. He does not choose the smallest, most tentative animals. He chooses the strongest ones, the ones with real power in their haunches, the ones that could pull a cart off its wheels if they decided to. And then he lowers the wooden beam across their necks. And they bend. And they pull. And the extraordinary thing is that all of that power, all of that raw capacity, is now going somewhere specific. Into the row. Into the field. Into next year's harvest. That bending is not weakness. That bending is how the strength gets directed towards something real. The noun form that appears most frequently in the Hebrew Bible is Anav, H6035 in Strong's. It carries the same root image, bowed down, lowly, pressed under. And the abstract noun built from that root, Anava, H6038, is translated 3 different ways in the King James Version alone: humility, meekness, and gentleness, depending on the passage. 3 English words for 1 Hebrew root, which tells you something important. The translators were reaching. They were hunting for the right English word and couldn't quite close the gap. Because English doesn't have a single word that means the power of a strong creature submitted to a governing yoke. Now here is the moment the whole channel was built for. The first time the word Anav appears in the Torah, not in poetry, not in the prophets, but in Moses' own writings, in the raw historical narrative, it is not applied to a concept or an abstract virtue. It is applied to a person, and that person is Moses himself. Numbers 12 verse 3, the text reads, "Now the man Moses was very humble, more than all people who are on the face of the earth." Very humble. In Hebrew, Anav me'od, exceeding Anav, the most bowed down man on the surface of the entire earth. Me'od, that intensifier, is the same word used in the great Shema, in Deuteronomy 6:5. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your me'od, all your intensity. Moses is the most intensely Anav human being who has ever lived. Stop. Because if your translation has trained you to think humble means low self-opinion, this verse is almost impossible to understand. Moses had just led approximately 2 million people out of the most powerful empire on earth. He had stood before Pharaoh face to face and refused to back down through 10 successive catastrophes. He had stretched his staff over the Red Sea and the water divided. He had spoken with God directly. Exodus 33:11 says God spoke to Moses face to face, as a man speaks to his friend. Moses was the single most consequential human being in Israelite history up to that point, the recipient of the entire law, the founder of the covenant community. And the text stops the narrative to inform you that this man was the most bowed down creature on earth. If humble means what English has taught you it means, you have a near contradiction on your hands. How does the most visibly powerful leader in Israel maintain the lowest opinion of himself? How does the man who argued directly with God, Abraham bargained over Sodom, Moses argued over the golden calf, demanding that God not destroy Israel? How does that man qualify as the pinnacle of meekness? But if Anav means yoked, fully submitted to the weight placed on him by God, fully directed by the authority that fastened the beam, the Numbers 12:3 is not a puzzle. It is a precise portrait. Moses carried an enormous yoke, a yoke heavier than any human being had ever carried. 2 million people, 40 years, impossible terrain, constant rebellion. And the thing the text is telling you about him, the thing God is stopping to say in Numbers 12, is this. Moses never once tried to shake the yoke off. He never bent the load toward his own advantage. He never used the divine weight as leverage for his own ambitions. His power went exactly where the yoke aimed it, every time, for 40 years. That is the Hebrew picture of the most Anav man on earth. Here is the scene that gives this verse its teeth. Numbers 12:1, just 2 verses before, Miriam and Aaron, Moses' own siblings, begin criticizing him. They challenge his authority, they question his marriage and use it as a cover for the real grievance. They want a share of his prophetic status. Has the Lord spoken only through Moses? They ask. Has he not spoken through us also? And the text notes, almost parenthetically, that the Lord heard this. Then comes verse 3. The narrator inserts this observation about Moses' character right in the middle of the conflict. Why? Because what follows is God defending Moses. And the reader needs to understand why. It is precisely because Moses does not defend himself. The most Anav man alive does not use his position to crush a complaint. He is too bent under the yoke to waste power on personal vindication. But the word carries a harder edge than most word study videos will tell you. The root ana does not only appear in settings of voluntary submission, it appears throughout the Old Testament in contexts that are darker, more involuntary, more painful. The verb form means to press down, to oppress, to afflict by force. It is used in Exodus 1:11 to describe what Pharaoh did to the Israelites in Egypt. He set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. The same root. The oppressor and the meek man both get described by the same family of words. This is not a contradiction. It is actually the key to the whole concept. Gesenius's Hebrew Chaldee lexicon defines anav as afflicted, with the added sense of a lowly, pious, and modest mind that prefers to bear injuries rather than return them. That final phrase is doing extraordinary work. Prefers to bear injuries rather than return them. This is not someone who doesn't feel the weight. This is someone who feels it fully and chooses not to weaponize it. The Anav person is not someone who has no capacity for retaliation. They are someone who has that capacity and sets it aside. The yoke is chosen, not merely suffered. Micah 6:8 gets at this from another angle. He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. Walk humbly. In Hebrew, hatznia lechet. The verb there is from a different but related concept, to make oneself inconspicuous, to go quietly. But the full picture across the Hebrew Bible is consistent. The humble person before God is not the one who vanishes. It is the one who moves with direction, who walks in step with something larger than their own ambitions. And then there is Isaiah 53. Isaiah chapter 53, verse 7, the suffering servant prophecy, the text that both Jewish and Christian scholars have wrestled with for millennia. The verse reads, He was oppressed, and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. Afflicted. In Hebrew, the nifal participle form of ana, the same root as anav, the servant being led to slaughter, the one whose suffering purchases something for others, is described as na-ne, ana, bowed, underweight. And the verse does something that should stop you entirely. It pairs that affliction with silence. He was bowed down, and he did not open his mouth. He was under the weight, and he chose not to use his voice to lift it, like a sheep before its shearers. The image is deliberately agricultural. An animal being sheared makes no resistance. The power it has, if it has any, is not deployed. And the servant moves through his suffering with that same quality. Not because he is powerless, but because the yoke is on, and the direction is set, and he goes where the yoke aims him. Isaiah 53:4 gives you the context that makes this even sharper. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. He bore, he carried, he was under a load. And the whole chapter insists that this bearing was not passive absorption, it was substitutionary. He carried something that should have gone somewhere else. That is not weakness. That is the ultimate anav. Strength bent entirely in a direction chosen by another. Now bring Matthew 11 into the room, verses 28 through 30. Jesus is speaking. He says, Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, For I am meek and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And everything in that passage is deliberate. He is speaking to a Jewish audience that knows what a yoke is. It is the metaphor first-century rabbis used for the Torah itself, for a teacher's interpretation and application of God's law. Every rabbi had a yoke. Every disciple put it on. When Jesus says, "Take my yoke," he is not speaking in metaphor and hoping you'll catch it. He is making a direct claim about authority and direction. He is saying, "I have a yoke, and it fits differently than the one you've been carrying." The Greek word translated meek in Matthew 11:29 is praus. And the semantic range of praus in agricultural Greek is exactly what you would now expect. It was used to describe a horse or an ox that had been broken, meaning trained, disciplined, brought under direction. A praus animal was not a weak animal. It was a powerful one that moved with its master. Some scholars trace the word to a root meaning mild or easy, but its application in Greek literature is overwhelmingly to strength that has been domesticated into usefulness. That is the word Jesus uses to describe himself in the same breath as the invitation to wear his yoke. And note the pairing in verse 29, meek and lowly in heart. Praus and tapeinos, two Greek words. The first describing the trained, directed quality of his power. The second, tapeinos, meaning low, pressed down, close to the ground. In its earliest Greek uses, tapeinos was not a compliment. It meant humble in the sense of socially low, economically crushed. But in the mouth of Jesus in Matthew 11, the combination becomes a theological statement. I am the one with directed power and a pressed down position. I am the most Anav being who has ever stood in front of you, and I am offering you my yoke. Here is where the honest accounting has to happen, because this is the part most videos leave out. The word Anav in the Hebrew Bible is not always the noble, chosen kind of bowing. Scholars point out, correctly, that Anav bleeds into ani, the word for the materially poor, the economically crushed. In Amos 2:7, the text condemns those who trample the head of the poor, the Anav, into the dust. In Isaiah 61:1, the famous passage Jesus quotes in Luke 4 in the synagogue at Nazareth, the phrase is to bring good news to the poor, to the Anav. And in context, this almost certainly includes people ground down by poverty, not just people who have chosen a posture of spiritual submission. So if you walk away from this video thinking that the Hebrew word Anav is simply a spiritual virtue of the noble and the strong, you are flattening something the text keeps three-dimensional. The word holds both. The voluntary bowing of the powerful person who has submitted to God's direction, and the involuntary bowing of the crushed person who is crying out from under a weight they did not choose. And the Psalms use both senses in the same breath. Psalm 10:17 says, "O Lord, you hear the desire of the afflicted, the Anavim, you will strengthen their heart." That is not an address to powerful people who have nobly chosen submission. That is an address to people whose neck is under a beam that was not of their choosing, who are asking the God of the universe to notice. What the Hebrew holds together that English forces apart is this: both kinds of bowing matter. Both kinds of bowing are seen. And in both kinds, the question that determines everything is the same. Is this load going somewhere? Is there a direction this suffering serves? Now bring all of this home. Proverbs 22:4 says, "By humility and the fear of the Lord are riches and honor and life." The word translated humility is anavah, the abstract noun H6038, the whole concept in a single word. And the fear of the Lord, Yirat Adonai, is standing next to it. By anavah and Yirat Adonai come riches, honor, life. Not by self-erasure, by yoking yourself to the right authority and fearing the right thing. The verse is not a personality prescription, it is a geometry. You are always bent towards something. The question is not whether you are yielded. You are yielded. You are always pulling in some direction, always directed by something, always spending your capacity on something. The question is, what is on the other end of the yoke? Bend toward the fear of the Lord, toward living in genuine alignment with the reality of who God is, and what you carry comes back to you as life. There is one more verse that has to come into the room before we land this. Zephaniah 2:3, one of the most searching verses in the minor prophets. The prophet Zephaniah, writing in a dark period before the Babylonian invasion, says this: "Seek the Lord, all you humble of the land, who do his commands. Seek righteousness, seek humility. Perhaps you may be hidden on the day of the anger of the Lord. Seek the Lord, all you humble of the land." In Hebrew, bakshu anavah, seek anavah, seek the state of being yoked. This is extraordinary because anavah is already the noun form of the virtue. It is the state of being anav. And yet the prophet says, seek it, pursue it, as if it is something you can orient toward, something you can increase your portion of, something you can make a deliberate direction in your life. and the context is devastating. Zephaniah is writing to people who are about to be crushed. The day of the Lord is coming. Babylon is on the way. And the prophet does not say, "Get strong." He does not say, "Fortify the walls," or "Arm the soldiers," or "Trust in your alliances." He says, "Seek Anavah." Get your neck under the right beam before the storm hits. Because if the weight that is coming is going to bend you regardless, and it is, the question is whether it finds you already yielded, already directed, already facing the right way. Perhaps you may be hidden. In Hebrew, ulei tisatu, maybe. A stunning epistemic humility from the prophet himself. Not a guarantee, a possibility. Maybe if you pursue the yoke before the weight arrives, you will find shelter on the day the weight falls. The text does not promise you safety in exchange for anavah. It promises you a better orientation going into whatever comes next. That verse has lived in military campaigns and economic collapses and medical diagnoses for 3,000 years. And every time a human being has read it with the Hebrew root in mind, not be passive and self-effacing, but get your neck under the right authority before the storm, the verse has landed differently. That reframe is where this word becomes most uncomfortable. Because if humble means low self-opinion, you can perform it. You can say the right things, deflect the right compliments, position yourself correctly in conversations, and call it virtue. Many people do this for decades. It becomes its own form of subtle control. The humble person who needs you to notice how humble they are. But if Anav means yoked, if it means your actual direction, the real orientation of your power and your time and your capacity, then it is not performable. You can't fake a yoke. Either the beam is on you or it isn't. Either the direction of your life is actually submitted to something larger than your own ambitions, or it's pointed at those ambitions with a thin coating of religious language over the top. Moses was not modest. He was not self-effacing. He was directed. And the gap between those two things is the entire distance between what your English Bible implies and what the Hebrew actually says. Here is what scholars who study this word seriously tend to say, and it is worth sitting with. The line between Anav as spiritual virtue and Anav as victimhood is not always as sharp in the text as we would like. The same word family describes the Israelites oppressed in Egypt, Moses, the freely submissive leader, the suffering servant going to slaughter, and the poor being crushed in Amos's day. Translators choose between humble, meek, poor, afflicted, and gentle depending on context, and they do not always agree. What that should tell you is that the concept is more unified at the root than we make it in English. The Hebrew language is not making a clean distinction between the spiritual virtue of humility and the social reality of oppression. It is treating both as versions of the same thing. A bent neck, a person underweight. And the God of Israel, across the entire sweep of the Old Testament, shows up for both kinds. That is not a weakness in the word. That is the most important thing the word says. Because it means that when Jesus stands up in the synagogue in Nazareth, in Luke 4, and reads from Isaiah 61, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor," to the Anav, he is not just speaking to people who have chosen spiritual submission. He is speaking to people who are bowed down because life pressed them there, to the ones who did not choose the yoke. And he is saying, "I see that, and I have put on the same yoke, and my yoke fits differently." Moses chose the yoke and became the most Anav man alive. The suffering servant had the yoke placed on him and went silent to the slaughter. Jesus does both. He chooses the cross, and the cross is placed on him by others. And in that collision of voluntary and involuntary bowing, the whole concept of Anav reaches its fullest expression. And you, whoever is watching this right now, you are probably carrying a mixture of both kinds. Some of the weight on your neck you put there in obedience. Some of it you never asked for. Some of your bowing is Moses bowing. "I submitted this to God on purpose." And some of it is Psalm 22 bowing. "I am face down in dust I didn't choose, and I am crying out, and I need to know that someone is listening." The Hebrew says the same word applies to both, and the God of the Hebrew Bible responds to both. So when you ask what it means to be humble, Anav, The Hebrew is not telling you to have lower opinions of your abilities or to make yourself smaller in rooms where you have something to offer. It is asking you a more surgical question. Where is your neck? What is your power submitted to? And on the days when the bowing is not chosen, when life has pressed you down into a shape you never wanted, do you know that even that bowing has a name in this language? Even that one was seen? The most Anav man alive brought 2 million people to a mountain where God spoke. The most Anav figure in Isaiah went to a slaughter he did not deserve and bore something he did not owe. The one who called himself Praus, meek in Greek, the direct heir of the Hebrew Anav, stood up in a synagogue and announced that the bent ones, the pressed down ones, the ones whose necks were under weight they hadn't chosen, were the very people his good news was aimed at, not the self-sufficient, the yoked. Where is the yoke in your life right now? And is it the right one? That is the question the Hebrew word was always asking. Your English Bible just didn't have room for it. If something in this changed how you read a verse or changed how you think about a season you're in, I want to know. Put it in the comments. This is the place where those conversations happen. And if you haven't subscribed, there is a reason to do it now beyond this video. Next week, we are going inside the Hebrew word shalom. A word every person watching this has heard 100 times and believes they understand. The translation gives you peace. The Hebrew gives you something so much stranger and more demanding that it will change how you read every verse you thought you knew. Same channel, same approach. The original word, every time. The most powerful man who ever lived kept his neck inside a yoke and never shook it off. For 40 years, through the wilderness. The Hebrew calls that strength. Maybe it was.